Christmas had always been loud in our house. The hum of conversation, the jingle of laughter, the clinking of glasses. It all blended into a warm, chaotic symphony. This year, with the snow blanketing the cul-de-sac and the fireplace crackling, everything felt just right. My brothers debated football stats over eggnog, while my parents, settled on the couch, watched the younger kids tear into their second round of presents. I soaked it all in, a quiet gratitude washing over me. This was our family. Big, loud, imperfect, but solid. Until the knock. It wasn't a regular knock, the kind you hear from neighbors dropping off cookies. This was a pounding, desperate and sharp, rattling the door on its hinges. My heart sank. I glanced around the room. Everyone else had heard it too. Eyes wide, mouths quieted. I stood, every step toward the door heavier than the last. Opening it felt like a mistake, even as I did it. The man on the porch didn't belong. His clothes hung loose, mismatched layers with holes that let the cold in. His eyes, wide and unfocused, darted between me and the warmly lit house behind me. He scratched at his neck, fingers twitching. The smell hit me, a sour, metallic mix of sweat and something sharper, chemical. I knew it before he spoke. Meth, maybe. Something worse. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice tight and strained. There was no mistaking the threat in those words. He wasn't asking. My mind raced. Closing the door wasn't an option. I stepped aside. As he walked in, the air in the room thickened. Conversations stopped, smiles faded. He scanned the room, eyes never settling, body restless. My youngest niece clung to her mother, sensing something was off, even if she didn't know what. I watched my brother, Nick, make a subtle move toward his phone, but I shook my head. Don't. Not yet. The man flopped onto the couch, his body jerking like a marionette with half its strings cut. His eyes fixed on the food spread across the dining table. "Looks good," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Every instinct screamed to get him out. But how? Every move felt like it might set him off. I could see it in his eyes, chaos barely held in check. You, need anything?" I asked, my voice steadying itself through sheer will. He grinned, a hollow thing. "Just here for the holiday cheer." His hands drummed on his knees, erratic, frantic. He wasn't sitting still for long. He got up, paced the room, stopped to stare at family photos on the mantel. His breathing quickened, a low muttering under his breath. I couldn't catch the words, but I didn't need to. I knew the type. Volatile, unpredictable. One wrong word could tip the balance. I glanced at my sister, Sarah. She had her phone in her hand, hidden just out of view, her fingers moving slowly. Texting? No. Dialing. I could only hope she was calling the police, but if he saw... "Who's she talking to?" he snapped, spinning to face us. The room shrank. He was on her in 2 steps, yanking the phone from her hand. His eyes blazed. "Think you're smart?" I took a step forward. "Hey, it's Christmas. Let's just sit down. You're our guest." He stared at me, eyes narrowing. For a second, I thought I'd said the wrong thing, but he backed off, pacing again, muttering. My pulse thudded in my ears. Minutes stretched. He picked up an ornament from the tree, turning it over in his hands too hard. Glass. Fragile. I waited for it to shatter, for the outburst. It didn't come. Not yet. The kids had been ushered into the kitchen, silent as shadows. My parents sat stiffly, the silence pressing on all of us like a held breath. I tried to keep him talking, keep him calm. His answers were disjointed, fragmented. Stories that didn't line up. His hands never stopped moving. My eyes flicked to the clock. How long had it been? 10 minutes? 15? It felt like hours. Where were the police? Then he stopped. Froze. Something shifted in the room. I saw it in his eyes first. A wild spark, the tether snapping. "You think I'm stupid," he hissed, voice low, dangerous. "All of you, sitting here judging, laughing at me." "No one's laughing," I said, voice low, steady. "We just want you to have a good Christmas." He wasn't listening. He threw the ornament. It shattered against the wall, glass splinters scattering like frost. His breathing quickened, fists clenching. My heart hammered. This was it. Nick moved first, trying to step between him and the rest of the family. But the man lashed out, a wild swing that caught Nick across the face. Chaos erupted. Furniture toppled. My father tried to grab the man's arms, but he was wiry, strong in that drug-fueled way. He broke free, grabbing a heavy candle holder from the table, swinging wildly. Then the sirens. Red and blue lights flashing through the window. He froze, eyes wide, chest heaving. The door burst open, officers flooding in, weapons drawn. It was over in seconds. They had him pinned, cuffed, dragged out the door, still screaming about betrayal, about Christmas. Silence settled, heavy and thick. We stood there, the room in shambles, the smell of adrenaline and fear hanging in the air. My brother's face bled from a shallow cut. My niece cried softly, clutching her mother. I sank into a chair, hands shaking. The warmth of the night was gone, replaced by something colder. December had always been a time for family, warmth, and festive cheer. This year, however, the cold bite of winter felt sharper than ever. Since my mother's death last month, everything had been off-kilter. The holidays, usually my favorite time, were a haunting reminder of the loss, a silence in the place of her laughter. But I tried. For my kids, if nothing else, I tried to carry on. It was the first weekend in December when we took the kids to the mall. They were excited, faces pressed against the glass as we waited in line for the Santa photo. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. The mall Santa, a guy in a red suit with fake white beard, not much different from any of the others we'd met in years past. But there was something about him that day, something unsettling. His eyes lingered too long on my son, Alex, and when he spoke, it almost felt like he wasn't talking to him at all. Like he was speaking about him. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my own grief, and made a mental note to move on with the season. The first thing I noticed was the door. We were home late that night, the kids already asleep, when I noticed it standing ajar, barely an inch open. The kids always left it open, so I hadn't thought much of it. But that was before the creeping sense of something, someone, watching. I had locked it before bed. I was sure of it. It had clicked shut with a firm, definitive sound, as it always did. But there it was, cracked open like someone had been there. Maybe the wind? A mistake, I thought. Maybe I hadn't locked it all the way. I closed the door and shrugged it off, but a gnawing sensation crawled up my spine as I returned to the living room. The Christmas tree lights blinked softly in the darkness. A warm glow, but not enough to banish the chill creeping through my bones. The next day, the strange occurrences began in earnest. A book on the kitchen counter, one I had left on the shelf the night before, was now opened to a page I didn't recognize. I had no memory of reading it, and I certainly hadn't opened it to that specific page. I double-checked. It was my book, the one I'd been reading before bed. I shook my head, dismissing it. Maybe the kids had gotten into it. Maybe I was just distracted. Then, a few days later, there was the Christmas photo. The picture of Alex sitting on Santa's lap, the one I had framed and placed on the mantel. When I went to straighten it, I saw something. The photo, his eyes, they were different. Not the usual twinkle, but something darker, something intense. The Santa, the one I barely remembered, seemed to be looking right at the camera now. But there was no camera where he was sitting. The photographer had taken the picture from behind a velvet rope. I nearly dropped the frame, but I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Then, the sounds started. At first, it was faint, like a creak in the floorboards, the rustle of something moving just outside my vision. I dismissed it as the house settling or the wind. But night after night, they grew louder. The scratching, the muffled breathing, the soft whispering that seemed to come from just behind the wall. The kids slept through it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the house. I locked every door, double-checked the windows, and pulled the curtains tightly shut. Yet, I couldn't shake the paranoia gnawing at my insides. It was the night after Christmas when the most disturbing event happened. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner, the house quiet and dark except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I noticed the living room door was open again, wide this time. I hadn't been in there since I'd tucked the kids into bed, and I had been certain I'd locked it. I went to close it, heart hammering, but then I froze. Something was wrong. I wasn't alone. There, in the middle of the room, was a figure, tall, shadowed, standing perfectly still. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and then I heard it. A soft voice, a low, gravelly whisper. He's so perfect. I recognized it. It was his voice, the mall Santa. The figure didn't move, but the smell hit me. Sickly sweet, like stale candy canes and old leather. The smell that had clung to him in the mall. He was here, in my house. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. But as I turned to flee, I stumbled over something. The photo. The frame had fallen off the mantel. It was face down on the floor. When I flipped it over, there was something new on the picture. A message, scrawled in what looked like ink, or was it blood? It read, "I'm watching. I see you." I barely made it to the phone before I heard the door creak open behind me. The cops didn't find anyone in the house. There was no sign of forced entry, no trace of the Santa anywhere. It was as if he had never been there at all. But I knew he had been, and I knew he would return. In the days that followed, things only got worse. The kids started having nightmares, waking up screaming about the man in the red suit. Alex wouldn't stop drawing pictures of a strange, bearded figure watching him from the window. I don't know what happened to the Santa after that. I never went back to that mall, but I couldn't escape him. The feeling, the constant, crawling sensation that someone was there, standing just out of view, always watching. I don't know how long it's been. A week? 2? I lost track of time. All I know is that I'm starting to lose my grip on what's real. I swear I hear him sometimes, whispering from the dark. I keep locking the doors, but I'm not sure if it matters anymore. It's December, and my house feels emptier than it ever has. The Christmas decorations are up, snowflakes on the windows, a garland around the fireplace. But it doesn't feel festive. It feels like a stage, and I'm just waiting for the next scene to start. I haven't been in the holiday spirit ever since Anna left. I can still hear her voice sometimes echoing in the quiet rooms, even though she hasn't lived here for a month. It's a strange kind of emptiness. The kind you don't notice at first because you're too caught up in the whirlwind of everything falling apart. But then it hits you, slowly, like a cold draft that you can't trace. The silence is the worst part. The first thing I noticed was the door to the basement. It was open. I didn't think much of it at first. I probably left it open in my distracted state, so I closed it. The house was mine now, even if I didn't know how to live in it alone. That night, I locked the door. But the next morning, it was open again. I remember standing there, staring at the basement door. Was I losing my mind? I could have sworn I'd locked it. Maybe I was just forgetful. I'd been under a lot of stress lately. But even as I told myself that, a prickling feeling crawled up my neck, and I couldn't shake it. The noises started after that. At first, they were faint, like someone moving around in another room. Little things, shuffling feet, a soft rustle like the sound of fabric brushing against a wall. Nothing that I could really place, but enough to make me pause and listen. I'd always been one to brush off odd sounds. After all, houses make noises. But these felt different, too deliberate, like someone was in the house with me. I checked all the windows, locked. All the doors, shut tight. Everything seemed fine, but the unease stayed with me. It wasn't until I found the cup on the kitchen counter that things started to shift. I don't drink coffee, Anna used to. We always had a cup in the morning together, but that day there was a half-empty mug of coffee on the counter. It was cold, sitting there, waiting for me to find it. At first, I thought maybe Anna had come by, perhaps to grab some of her things, but when I checked the door, it was locked, the same as always. And she hadn't reached out. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. Someone had been here, but who and why? I checked the cameras I had around the house. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I walked into a room, I felt it, like someone was waiting just out of sight. One evening, I went into the living room to find the family photo on the mantel slightly askew. I don't know how long it had been that way. I could have sworn it had been straight just hours before. My hand shook as I adjusted it back into place, but the unease continued to grow. Something was wrong. I had always been so careful about where I put things. I couldn't stop the thoughts that started creeping in. Had I done something to make someone angry? Did I have an enemy I wasn't aware of? The paranoia started to settle in, eating at the edges of my mind. Was I losing my grip on reality? I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining it, that everything had a logical explanation. Maybe I was just getting too caught up in the aftermath of my breakup. But then I found the note. It was folded neatly in the kitchen drawer, wedged between the utensils, as if it had been placed there intentionally. I hadn't put it there. The handwriting was spidery, like it belonged to someone who had been writing for too long without rest. The note read, "I know you don't remember me, but I remember you." My heart stopped. I slammed the drawer shut. Who was doing this? I had no idea. But something deep inside me knew that it wasn't just in my head anymore. That night, I locked every door and window and stayed up late, listening to every little sound in the house, the faint rustling, the sound of the floorboards creaking as though someone was moving across the room. Then, at 3 a.m., I heard it, a loud thump, followed by a scraping sound like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I was paralyzed with fear. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the door that led into the hallway, knowing that whatever was happening wasn't just a trick of my mind. Someone had been here, and they were still here. I grabbed the phone, but the signal was gone. The Wi-Fi was down too. It was like the house itself had become a trap. I didn't know how long I sat there in the dark, but eventually I heard the front door creak open. A chill ran through me. The house was silent again, as though it had always been. In the morning, I found the final clue, the last piece that shattered my already fragile grip on reality. The family photo had been tampered with. The edges of it had been frayed, like someone had been fiddling with it for hours, obsessing over it. And then I saw it. The faint outline of a face that wasn't supposed to be there, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the reflection on the glass. It was then I realized the stalker wasn't a stranger. I knew him. I should have known. He was the quiet guy from down the street, Walter. He'd always been a bit odd, but harmless, right? I had never thought anything of it. He had been the one to help me with the Christmas lights last year, talking to me about his obsession with home security systems. It was him. He'd been watching me, watching my family. I never saw him again after that night. I left the house, abandoned it as if it were cursed, but the horror of those weeks stays with me. The strange part, though, is how he vanished. It was as though he never existed, erased from the neighborhood entirely. The real terror is that I never knew when it began or when it ended.